Ladies and gentlemen, what unsettles controlling people more than anything is your willingness to be vulnerable. Not because you're weak, but because you refuse to pretend. You don't hide your heart. You don't shrink yourself to make others comfortable. And you don't play the game of emotional camouflage. That kind of presence, that kind of raw honesty, it's disruptive. In a world where so many people have learned to protect themselves with silence, with performance, with perfectionism, vulnerability becomes a kind of revolution. You show up fully, messily, honestly, and that scares the hell out of anyone who's built their identity on power, manipulation, or image management. Because here's the truth, people who thrive on control don't know what to do with someone who isn't trying to control anything. You're not posturing. You're not pretending to be fine when you're not. You're not curating your emotions to be more digestible. And that terrifies them. Because when someone is invested in shaping the way others feel about them, vulnerability feels like chaos. It's unpredictable. It can't be managed or measured. It doesn't follow a script. But you're not following a script. You're telling the truth about who you are, about what hurts, about what matters. And you're doing it even when it's uncomfortable. Especially when it's uncomfortable. The people who rely on fear, guilt, and confusion to keep others small cannot stand that kind of freedom. Because your openness invites something dangerous to them, real connection. Real connection requires honesty. And honesty requires courage. When you're vulnerable, you give others permission to be human. You create a space where authenticity can breathe. And that space doesn't just threaten their control, it dismantles it. They want you guarded. Quiet, doubtful. They want you wrapped up in shame, second-guessing your worth, shrinking from your own voice. Vulnerability does the opposite. It says, this is me, all of me, and I'm not hiding anymore. It's not loud or aggressive. It doesn't need to be. Vulnerability speaks softly, but it carries truth. And truth always rattles those who build power and illusion. See, vulnerability isn't about oversharing. It's not about bleeding out in front of people who haven't earned access to your heart. It's about showing up in your life without a mask. It's about saying I'm worthy even with my cracks. It's about living in a way that honors the mess and the magic. And when you choose to live that way, you disrupt every narrative that says worth must be earned. You interrupt the lie that says love is conditional. You shatter the illusion that perfection is the goal. Vulnerability tells the truth about what it means to be alive, that we ache, that we hope, that we try, that we fail, that we get back up, that we want to be seen and known and loved just as we are. And when someone who thrives on superiority encounters that kind of realness, they don't know what to do with it because they can't manipulate what's already exposed. They can't shame someone who isn't hiding. They can't gaslight a person who knows what's true in their bones. You don't play the game, and that infuriates them. You don't give them the satisfaction of control. You don't respond to their coldness with begging. You don't respond to their arrogance with appeasement. You stay soft but rooted, tender but grounded. That kind of softness, it's not weakness. It's strength in its purest form. It takes an enormous amount of courage to live with an open heart in a world that sometimes tells you to shut it down. It takes grit to keep showing up, keep feeling, keep hoping when it would be so much easier to go numb. But you've learned that numbness is too high a price to pay for safety. You've chosen to feel, to speak, to show up. And that choice, that's the one thing they can't stand about you. Because it means you're not playing the role they wrote for you. You're writing your own story in ink, on your terms. And yes, there will be people who are deeply uncomfortable with that. They'll roll their eyes at your honesty. They'll try to diminish your light with sarcasm or superiority. They'll attempt to label you as too sensitive, too much, too emotional. But those labels, they're just projections. They say more about the person throwing them than they ever will about you. So keep going, keep living with your heart open, keep choosing truth over performance. Keep honoring your own voice even when it shakes. That vulnerability, the kind that's laced with strength, not shame, is exactly what sets you free. It's not the loudest in the room that holds the most power. It's the one who's willing to say, I'm here. I'm real. And I'm not afraid to be seen. There's something quietly powerful about a person who knows who they are. Not in a loud, performative, look at me way, but in a steady, grounded, deeply rooted kind of way. When you carry that sense of self, not the version of you that others try to define, but the real you, it disrupts every room you walk into. Not because you're trying to dominate it, but because you're no longer trying to fit into it. And here's the thing, some people simply cannot stand that. When you know who you are, you become immovable, not rigid, not closed off, but unshakable. You've done the work, you've faced your own patterns. You've sat in silence and asked yourself the hard questions. You've owned your mistakes, grieved your losses, confronted your insecurities, and learned to stand in your own truth without apology. And the moment you stop relying on someone else to validate your worth, the game changes. Because some people, especially those who depend on power dynamics to feel secure, rely on your confusion. They thrive when you're unsure of yourself, when you second guess your intuition, when you look to them to tell you who you're allowed to be. Your uncertainty keeps them in control. Your self-doubt feeds their sense of superiority. That's the blueprint of manipulation. Keep the other person questioning themselves so they don't. Notice how much power they've given away. But once you reclaim that power, once you remember that your worth is inherent, not negotiable, you become harder to manipulate. You start saying things like, no, that doesn't work for me, or that's not who I am, or I don't accept that narrative. And for people who are used to others bending, breaking, and shrinking around their egos, that kind of clarity feels threatening. You don't respond the same way anymore. You don't get swept up in emotional chaos. You don't internalize their criticism or take their silence as proof that you failed. You don't adjust your light to make them more comfortable in their shadows. You simply remain you. Calm, clear, whole. That presence alone can be unsettling to someone who has spent their life shaping the identities of others. Because when you refuse to be shaped by fear, guilt, or shame, they lose their grip. Their usual tactics don't land. Their silence doesn't shake you. Their blame doesn't break you. You've built something within yourself that they can't touch, and that's what gets to them the most. See, the person who stands firm in who they are doesn't need to explain themselves constantly. They don't need to be the loudest or most liked. They don't need every room to approve of them. They walk in alignment with their own values. They move from integrity. And while they're open to feedback, they are not available for manipulation. That difference, it's everything. But this didn't come easily. You weren't born with that unshakable sense of self. You earned it. You fought for it. You walked through confusion, betrayal, gaslighting, rejection. You experienced relationships that tried to redefine you, turning your empathy into a weakness, your boundaries into selfishness, your voice into a threat. And maybe for a while you believed it. Maybe you did shrink. Maybe you did lose your footing. But not anymore, because at some point you woke up, maybe slowly, maybe all at once. But you realized that the people who loved the most diluted version of you weren't actually loving you. They were loving your compliance. They were loving your silence. And the price for that kind of love was too high. It cost you your peace, your voice, your identity. And you decided you're not paying that price anymore. So you started doing the work. You started returning to yourself. You started building trust with the person in the mirror again. And now here you are, more whole, more aware, more rooted than ever. And no, you're not perfect. But perfection was never the goal. The goal was wholeness. The goal was alignment. The goal was becoming someone you trust. And you've done that. Now, when someone tries to distort your reality, you pause. You don't immediately question yourself, you question the dynamic. You ask, is this about me? Or is this about their discomfort with me not being who they want me to be? That pause, that moment of clarity. That's the edge. That's the moment where power shifts back into your hands. Some people won't like it. They'll call you difficult, cold, distant. They'll say you've changed, and you have. But not because you've hardened. Because you've healed, and healing changes everything. Healing teaches you to stop chasing people who need you to be less. Healing teaches you to hold your center when someone else loses theirs. Healing teaches you that love doesn't require you to abandon yourself, so let them be uncomfortable. Let them misunderstand you. You don't need to shapeshift for anyone anymore. You don't owe anyone a watered-down version of your truth. You have fought too hard to know who you are to hand that over again. And that's the one thing they can't stand. Empathy is often misunderstood. People assume it means giving endlessly, absorbing everyone else's pain, putting your needs last. But real empathy, the kind that's rooted in self-awareness, boundaries, and inner strength, isn't about losing yourself. It's about standing beside someone in their pain without climbing into it and forgetting who you are. And that balance, that's rare, that's powerful. That's the thing certain people can't stand about you. Because you care deeply, but you've learned how to care without betraying yourself. You've figured out how to stay connected without becoming consumed. That ability to empathize without erasing your own voice threatens anyone who thrives on emotional control. They expect your compassion to come with compliance. They count on your kindness turning into self-sacrifice. But you've learned the difference. You've learned that empathy doesn't mean saying yes when you want to say no. It doesn't mean letting someone cross your boundaries just because you understand why they're struggling. It doesn't mean softening your truth to protect someone else's comfort. Real empathy is clear. It's rooted in love, but it's guided by truth. And people who want power without accountability don't know what to do with that kind of clarity. Because when you were younger, less healed, less self-aware, maybe you did give too much. Maybe you did confuse love with rescue. Maybe you stayed in situations where your empathy became your burden. You saw their pain and you thought it was your job to fix it. You thought that if you just loved them enough, tolerated enough, gave enough, they'd change. And maybe they didn't. Maybe instead they took and took and took until you couldn't recognize yourself anymore. But something shifted. You began to ask, why do I believe I have to break myself and have to prove I care? You started to see that compassion isn't measured by how much of yourself you lose. That real empathy starts with including yourself in the equation. That you can't pour from a cup that's always empty. That self-abandonment isn't noble, it's harmful. Now, you love with boundaries. You give, but not beyond your limits. You show up, but you don't sacrifice your mental health to do so. You can sit with someone's pain without making it your own. That emotional maturity doesn't mean you've hardened. It means you've healed. You've cultivated the strength to feel deeply and hold your center. You've learned to say, I see you're hurt, but I won't harm myself to hold it. That unnerves people who are used to exploiting emotional availability. Because when your empathy came without boundaries, you were easier to control. They could weaponize your guilt. Twist your caring nature into compliance. But now your empathy is anchored in self-respect. And that makes you unreadable to someone who only knows how to relate through domination. You still feel things deeply. But you don't lose yourself in other people's storms. You've learned how to hold space without absorbing everything. You've learned to listen without carrying, to care without collapsing. And you've realized that just because someone is hurting doesn't mean they get a free pass to hurt you. This kind of emotional integrity is quiet, but it's fierce. It doesn't scream or demand. It just exists in a way that commands respect. You're not easily guilted. You're not easily shamed. You're no longer responding out of fear, obligation, or codependency. You've learned to pause, to breathe, to ask yourself, what do I need right now? What's true for me? What am I not willing to compromise on? And when you answer those questions honestly, you make decisions that honor both your heart and your boundaries. You don't overextend to prove your worth. You don't stay silent to avoid conflict. You don't let your empathy be used as a tool for manipulation. You are clear on one simple truth: loving others well begins with not abandoning yourself. Of course, not everyone will understand that shift, especially those who were once comfortable with you overextending. They may call you selfish, cold, uncaring, not because you are, but because you stop making their comfort your responsibility. You stop cushioning their consequences. You stop betraying your needs to protect their egos. Let them be uncomfortable. You're not here to be palatable. You're not here to make everyone feel good at your own expense. You're here to live truthfully, lovingly, and yes, empathetically, but also in a way that honors the fact that you matter too. Your empathy is not a weakness. It's not a flaw to be corrected, but it becomes a weapon against yourself when it isn't balanced with boundaries. And you've done the work to find that balance, that inner calibration that says, I love you, I see you, and I'm still going to take care of me. That kind of strength isn't loud. It doesn't demand attention, but it shifts the dynamic in any room you enter. Because people can feel when someone is no longer easily controlled. They sense when your kindness has depth but also limits. And that honors anyone who is hoping to take more than you were ever meant to give. You are not too much. You are not too sensitive. You are not too empathetic. You are simply no longer abandoning yourself in the name of love. And that, more than anything, is what they can't stand. There's a quiet revolution in choosing to live without pretending. In a world that rewards image over integrity and performance over presence, telling the truth, especially emotional truth, is an act of courage. You refuse to play pretend. You don't wear the mask. You don't twist yourself into someone more acceptable or agreeable just to keep the peace. And for some people, that's a problem. Because pretending makes things comfortable for everyone but you. You've likely lived both sides of this. You've worn the smile when your heart was breaking. You've played the role they expected polite, quiet, accommodating while your soul screamed for authenticity. You've nodded when you disagreed. You've said, I'm fine, when you were anything but. You've diluted your truth so someone else could feel strong, right, or safe. And maybe that worked for a while. Maybe it bought you approval, kept the peace, helped you avoid conflict. But it also cost you your clarity, your power, and your self-trust. Because every time you perform a version of yourself that isn't rooted in truth, something inside you begins to erode. You stop trusting your gut. You question your feelings. You start wondering if the real you is too much or not enough. And slowly you disconnect from your voice, from your instincts, from your life. But then something shifts. It might not be loud or dramatic. It could be as simple as waking up one morning and thinking, I'm tired. Tired of pretending. Tired of managing everyone else's comfort while silently drowning in your own discomfort. Tired of editing your personality just to be easier to love. Tired of acting okay just because it's what others expect. So you stop. Maybe not all at once, maybe not perfectly, but you begin the work of reclaiming your truth. You start saying what you actually feel instead of what you're supposed to feel. You start showing up as your whole self, not just the polished, curated version. You learn to tolerate the discomfort of being misunderstood because it's still better than the pain of being unseen. And that's when things start to shift, not just within you, but around you. Some people embrace the real you. They feel relieved by your honesty. It gives them permission to show up more fully too. But others pull away, not because you're wrong, but because you're no longer playing a role that serves them. People who need control, predictability, or admiration to feel secure cannot stand when someone stops pretending. Your authenticity confronts their illusions. It disrupts the script. Because when you stop playing pretend, you stop participating in the game. You're no longer responding to their manipulation, their denial, or their projections in the same predictable ways. You stop nodding along. You stop laughing at jokes that aren't funny. You stop agreeing to things that go against your values. You become a mirror, not a mask. That kind of clarity scares people who have built their identities on pretense. They don't know how to relate to someone who won't play along. And so they label you difficult, dramatic, too emotional, too honest. But those labels, they're not about you. They're about their discomfort with the truth you represent. Because when you speak the truth, it forces people to confront their own. And not everyone is ready for that. Some people want connection, but only if it doesn't cost them control. They want closeness, but only if it doesn't require change. They want love, but only if it comes with silence. But you're not willing to trade your truth for belonging anymore. You've learned that real connection can't exist without authenticity. That love without truth is performance. That peace that depends on your silence isn't peace, it's compliance. And you've decided that if your truth makes someone else uncomfortable, that's okay. Discomfort isn't failure, it's growth. You no longer take responsibility for someone else's reaction to your honesty. You speak with kindness, yes, but also with courage. And you don't shrink just to make your truth easier to swallow. That doesn't make you unkind. It makes you honest. It makes you real. And realness is magnetic to those who are ready for it and repellent to those who aren't. But you've made peace with that. You've learned to walk away from spaces where your truth is too heavy for people still addicted to lightness. You no longer beg for understanding from those who are committed to misunderstanding you. You know who you are. You know what you feel. And you're willing to stand alone if it means standing in truth. You live with yourself now, not the version of yourself you tried to be for others. You sleep better. You breathe deeper. You trust your gut again. And even when it's hard, even when being honest feels like a risk, you do it anyway. Because you remember how empty the pretending felt, how exhausting it was to keep up the performance, how lonely it is to be praised for a version of you that isn't real. You're not here to perform. You're here to live, so no, you won't play pretend anymore, not to keep someone's ego intact, not to maintain a fragile peace, not to make yourself more likable or less threatening. You've tasted freedom, and you're not going back. And for some people, that refusal to pretend is deeply unsettling because it calls them to question their own mask. It confronts their need for control. It shines a light on everything they're still hiding from. But you're done hiding. You don't need to be perfect. You just need to be honest. That's what makes you powerful. And that's what they can't stand.